All right, so let's go ahead and start talking about the second part of Module 39. We're actually going to start delving into mood disorders. And when we talk about mood disorders, we're going to start with our first mood disorder slide here, talking about major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder. Now, when we talk about these disorders, it's important to keep in mind that it's more than just feeling down in terms of depression. It's more than just feeling sad about something. So what we're going to see when we talk about these mood disorders is it's not necessarily that it's just kind of a common everyday experience of kind of feeling down, saying someone's depressed, or someone feeling sad about something. But rather we see it's these kind of feelings, but to an extreme, and to an extreme where it lasts over a longer period of time. So we should, at different points, feel down or sad about something. Okay, so in fact, one of the things that's positive from depression or positive from sadness is it causes you to slow down, causes you to evaluate the situation, and in doing that, it keeps you from causing kind of worse harm to social relationships, harm to other relationships. It kind of gets you to slow down a little bit, think about things, and that's a good positive aspect of, when you do feel sad or down. It allows you to kind of readjust how you're approaching things. Now, the problem with major depressive disorder is that that feeling of sadness, that feeling of down is not productive because that person always feels that way. So while things may be going well, they're still not enjoying experiences. Okay, they're persistently feeling sad, feeling guilty about things that they shouldn't. So we'll talk more about these the symptoms of major depressive disorder. But the idea is that we're not just talking about feeling down. We're talking about feeling down for a long period of time, not being able to get kind of past things. Okay? Bipolar disorder, again, is something that shows kind of this extremes. It's more than just mood swings, but rather it's depression plus problematic overly or up mood behaviors called mania. So we have mood swings throughout the day. Okay, you might be feeling down about something, at the beginning of the day because you're kind of sad or worn out, but you get some energy towards the end of the day. Maybe you feel a lot more positive. Mood swings happen all the time. Okay, especially as we're quarantined. That shift in mood can happen anytime. I forget who it was, but one of the celebrities was talking about how their mood changes at any given moment throughout the day. And so these mood swings can happen, but in the case of bipolar, it's not just a simple mood swing, but rather it's this period of kind of being depressed and down that suddenly, within hours changes to this very up kind of manic feelings where the person is really kind of out of control in terms of their thinking. Okay? So let's start first with kind of talking about major depressive disorder, and we'll talk about the criteria for major depressive disorder. And we're doing the diagnosis or talking about the criteria for two reasons. The first is that this gives you a sense of how psychologists and therapists are going to work towards understanding if someone has a psychological disorder or not. They're going to do this in a way where they're going to look for the person's symptoms and use these symptoms to then diagnose if the person has a disorder. Okay, so the DSM will have these criteria that we're going to be talking about, and a therapist is going to evaluate if these symptoms are present. So major depressive disorder is not just one of these symptoms we'll talk about, but rather one or both of the first two symptoms, which are the key kind of diagnostic markers, plus three or more of the rest. So with major depressive disorder, for someone to be diagnosed, they need to either demonstrate depression mood most of the day and or markedly diminished interest in pleasure and activities. Okay, so they have to have either one or two of these criteria, or potentially both. And so we talked about depressed mood. We talked about this person feeling down. And the person feels down consistently throughout the day. So it's not just a fleeting moment. It's not maybe they're struggling with something. It's the person feels that way on a consistent basis throughout the day. And you might see that they feel that way throughout the day. And this might continue on for a longer period of time, over weeks. We also see, too, that when someone's depressed, they're no longer interested in things that they usually enjoy. So they might not be interested in socially engaging with others. Maybe they stop being involved in hobbies or sports. Maybe they're really great students, but that depression starts to really take away their motivation and abilities. So they stop gaining pleasure in terms of learning and being active in class. One of the things that came up earlier was talking about an increase or decrease in appetite or weight. So this is something that a therapist is going to evaluate for major depressive disorder. Is there someone gaining weight, maybe because they're lethargic and consuming a lot of food, not being active? Okay? Or maybe have they alternatively had kind of a loss of appetite where they're not hungry because they're so lethargic, so depressed that they're not really kind of interested in eating. Okay? Likewise, we talked about sleep as being an issue. Okay, so this was the things that you looked at in Diane's situation specifically, where we're trying to decide, does she have a major depressive disorder? And so we think about this, she demonstrated insomnia. So she was talking about how she kind of had disrupted sleep, how it wasn't good quality sleep. Okay? She talked about gaining weight. Okay, so far she's got almost all the criteria. She feels depressed mood most of the day. Okay? We didn't necessarily hear about her interest in other activities, okay, but maybe that could be included. We see alternatively too that the person might become lethargic. Okay, so they don't have energy. This is where they might be kind of laying on the sofa a whole bunch. They're not able to make it to activities because they just don't have the physical, mental energy to be to these different activities, do the things that they need to. Or they might be physically agitated where they just can't sit comfortably. Okay, they're kind of always at unease. Okay. They easily fatigue or lose energy. Okay, so they go to a class. Maybe you get done with the class. You're a little bit tired. You've been thinking hard, especially as you guys are having to take classes online. But for individuals who are experiencing depression, that's totally exhausting for these individuals. Okay, they lose all that energy. Individuals who are depressed often feel worthless. So they have that low self-esteem. They don't have any value in terms of what they do. And related to this, they experience an excessive or inappropriate guilt, meaning they're feeling bad for things that they really shouldn't feel bad for, that they had no responsibility for. They're feeling bad for things that happened that they really should potentially move on if it was a negative, or they just can't get past this. So we see that there's kind of this low value in terms of worthlessness, and this inappropriate guilt can start to come together and make the person feel very negative in that sense. We also see that there's daily problems in thinking and concentrating, making decisions. That's where that cognitive component starts to come in. So this is something where they're really kind of foggy. They're not able to process and think through different situations, and they're not able to concentrate. So as individuals go through quarantine, there's a lot of concern about depression developing because they're not able to have those social connections. And a lot of the way that depression may manifest itself is that people are just having a hard time thinking and concentrating. And it's hard enough to do with all the distractions at home, but imagine that also then starting to occur because of depression. We also see too that individuals who are experiencing depression may also have reoccurring thoughts of death and suicide. Okay, so if you interact with a therapist at all, if you're seeking treatment, one of the first things they're going to ask about is they're going to screen if you've had any thoughts about suicide. And that's not designed to scare you away, but rather to make sure that they're evaluating this criteria and put something in place, put a system in place to help you right away with that. Now, these are kind of the criteria of depression. Again, this gives you a sense of what the symptoms look like, what therapists are going to look for in terms of giving a diagnosis. Now, when we talk about bipolar disorder, the same kind of thing is going to happen, but we'll talk about it kind of more in terms of these kind of broad strokes. So bipolar disorder was once described as manic depressive disorder. So if you hear that terminology, that's synonymous with bipolar. And bipolar disorder is characterized by opposite moods. Okay, so an individual is going to go from depression, which we were just talking about, okay, to the new component of bipolar disorder, which is mania. And mania refers to a period of hyper-elevated mood that's euphoric, giddy, easily irritated, hyperactive, impulsive, overly optimistic, even grandiose. So I'll read it for you again. But it says mania, when an individual experiences this, is where they're hyper-elevated in kind of all dimensions. They're overly excited, they're very, very happy, to the point of being euphoric, they're giddy. They can get easily irritated because they're so hyperactive. Things kind of trigger them easily. They're overly optimistic, so they feel like they can do anything, even grandiose, where they feel like they can kind of take on the world. And what we see when we look at that list of contrasting symptoms, and again, this is posted for you guys, you don't have to get them all written down, is we see kind of the polar opposites of what's going on here, hence that bipolar disorder label. Okay? So with depression, an individual might feel excessive pessimism. With mania, they experience the opposite. So they're hugely optimistic. They feel like they can do anything. Depression, you might feel socially withdrawn, which is problematic because we need those social connections. For mania, it's the opposite. Okay, so with mania, they want to be around others constantly. But the biggest problem with mania is that there's a hypersexuality as well. Okay, so they're, hooking up with others. They're practicing potentially unsafe sex. These are behaviors that can become problematic later on. Okay, lack of pleasure leading to delight in everything. Okay, inactivity leading contrasting to impulsivity. Okay, so this is where they can start to be impulsive, make poor decisions. Okay, do things that they wouldn't normally do. Okay. We see this happening too in terms of their thought-making processes. Okay, so they're too fatigued to really focus on anything. Suddenly their mind still can't focus well, but in this case it's racing instead. Okay, so the mind won't settle down. They can process information. They go from being fatigued and tired, to then having unlimited energy and little desire for sleep. Okay, we know sleep is important for resting our bodies, helping us understand things. And I think one of the biggest things I want to show you with bipolar disorder, not only the symptoms, which you guys can look at more later, but this particular graph here. Okay, so, one of the biggest things that's occurring here, and I think is the biggest sign of things, is if we look at the brain and the brain activity, looking at the depressed state, you see there's very little activation. When we look at the brain, the biology of the brain slide, we see that in a manic state, all of a sudden there's a lot of activity within the brain. So just the next day, suddenly there's this burst of activity. Regions of the brain are super active, processing information, this hypersensitive response they're having, this overprocessing of information. And this occurs for several days, and then the brain goes back to this depressed state. So suddenly it goes back to kind of being where it's lethargic. There's not a lot of activity going on. And so we see is that brain activity diminishes in depression, increases in mania. We see too that we can start to tie this into different aspects of the brain. So the frontal lobe, tying it to the frontal lobe as being smaller in depression and fewer axons in the bipolar disorder. Okay, so we can actually tie it to physical structures of the brain being associated with these disorders. We can also do this with neurotransmitters as well. Okay, so there's more norepinephrine during mania, but depression leads to reduced serotonin. Okay, so the idea here is that we see neurotransmitters in the brain, going back to day one, talking about basic biology, that these neurotransmitters are changing. We'll talk about this quite a bit as we get into therapy. Okay? So the last piece I want to address just kind of quickly here, but it's an important piece, okay, one that we'll talk about later on, is depression's overall vicious cycle. So a depressed mood may develop when a person has a negative experience, and they keep repeating that stress over and over again. And it's how a person deals with that repeated stress that can kick off this vicious cycle. Okay? So we see is that depression may change a person's style of thinking and interacting in a way that then makes that experience more negative. So someone might have a stressful experience. Okay? They might have a stressful experience because they're being quarantined. Okay? You guys are going through this stressful experience. This is super unique. No one's really kind of experienced this in the modern day and age. And you start to experience this stressful experience, it might lead you then to explain things in a negative explanatory style. Okay, we start to think about things as being related to you, that this is always going to be this negative. That leads to this depressed mood. That depressed mood, you're feeling this low energy, starts to then lead to cognitive behavioral changes. Maybe you're not willing to work as hard as you did before. Maybe you feel more negative about things overall. Maybe you feel kind of more helpless. When you experience the next stressor, that type of negative cognitive behavioral changes then makes that next stressor that much worse. So we start to see this process kind of continues over and over again. Stressful experience makes you think more negatively about yourself, the way things are working, makes you feel kind of more hopeless. That makes you feel more depressed. That depression then changes your thought patterns, your behaviors, so you're not doing the things that are productive for you, helpful for you. That means the next stressor that you experience then becomes a harmful stressor for you. So today we kind of talked about the background of psychological disorders, how they develop, how we treat them. We started to get into some of our first psychological disorders. We'll continue talking about these on Thursday. Let me pause to see if you guys have any questions, things I can go back through. So what I'll do is I'll hang around a little bit after class if there's something specific I can help you guys with. Let me know through email if you like kind of the switched up format. We can stay with this. If you guys felt that you liked having the lecture slides up instead, going through it that way, we can switch back to that. So give me a little bit of feedback. Let me know. Otherwise, I hope you guys take care. I will see you on Thursday. Just let me know if you need anything. Again, I'll hang around a little bit more. Okay. So I'll talk to you guys later.